it's just wonderful to be able to build homes for people to live in that transforms their life. The home is the most important thing you have in your life to flourish. If you don't have a home, then there's, so many challenges you face.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. G'day and welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler Welsh, coming to you from Tamakimikoto, Auckland.
And I'm Zach Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
How you going, Zach?
I'm well. How are you, Matthew?
Pretty good. Autumn here. We had a massive rain dump. I've installed a weather station on our roof a few weeks ago, and when I left, it was over 10 mils since midnight. So we had 10 millimeters of rain in a fairly short period of time, which and now it's blue sky, so it's kind of crazy.
Well, it is totally gorgeous right now.
Yeah,
it's really beautiful.
Yeah, what's in keeping? I actually was at a building event, industry seminar yesterday, and it was all about building for climate change or building with climate change. It was definitely more on the resilience and adaptation side of things rather than on how do we reduce carbon, which I was a little bit disappointed about. I was waiting for the bit to talk about how we're going to actually make things better, but it was more talking about flooding, landslides, inundation, high wind, and high humidity. Interestingly, the prediction for where I am is getting warmer, longer periods of excessive heat, and around about the same total rainfall, but it coming in more intense bursts. Which I thought was interesting. That's the sort of prediction. Who knows what reality will be like? But regardless, that'll bump up the humidity when you get that combination of increasing temperature and lots of rain. So that's going to be a problem because we don't handle humidity with our building the way we do it here very well, particularly when that humidity is when there's a lot of it inside the building, which there does tend to be a lot of here. So, yeah, it's challenging times ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the impacts not only on human health, but also on the health of our buildings.
Yeah, and it just never ceases to amaze and also slightly frustrate me when we have the solutions for dealing with this, but there's just so much resistance to things like air tightness, or even in our case, continuous ventilation. That's just a huge challenge for us right now, is to convince people that windows don't work consistently enough by themselves, and that you actually need a fan to bring air into a house. So, yeah, that's taking up a lot of my time and energy at the moment, and probably for some time to come. Yeah. Anyway, we're gonna be jumping over to the other side of the world and talk about how things have been going in Scotland recently. We've got an interview which I did earlier this year, 2024, but it actually was sparked off by some news and headlines that I saw, I think, towards the end of 2023. So there's some great stuff there that we want to check in with. But before we do that, let's say thanks to our supporters.
Absolutely. So a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Thanks to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Glavel, Ingui Architecture, Minotaur, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. And thank you to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Gradient, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, Proseco, and Source 2050.
Awesome. All right. Well, I saw a headline, I think late in 2023, about some passive houses being built in Scotland. And there was a combination there of affordable housing, social type housing, and passive house. And I thought, that sounds really good, because I'd also heard that there were moves in Scotland to move the whole building code more in the direction effectively of passive house. So I reached out to Hanover, Scotland, and I eventually got to record a conversation with their chief executive, Angela Currie. And well, I think we'll just jump straight into it. And there is another episode or another podcast that we'll put a link to for a bit of background that people can also listen to, that Angela and a colleague of hers also took part in, with the addition of some comments from some of the tenants of the houses that they completed there. So we'll put that in the show notes, but let's jump in, and we'll have a bit of a debrief afterwards. This is Angela Currie, Chief Executive of Hanover, Scotland. Thank you very much, Angela, for joining me. Where are you situated at the moment?
I'm just outside of Edinburgh in Scotland.
And is that where you're based? Is Hanover sort of located in Edinburgh?
Yeah, our main office is in Edinburgh, but we have an office in Glasgow in the west of the country, and also on the northeast coast in a town called Elgin.
And for people who haven't had the pleasure of visiting your part of the world, what's it like? How would you describe it in terms of weather and just the type of the environment?
Yeah, well, Scotland's a country of 4 seasons, and you usually get them all in one day. Quite a cool climate, I suppose, in comparison to other countries. So our housing and our housing design is really important because of that cooler climate, quite a wet climate, particularly on the west coast.
So you're in the middle of winter, or just coming out of winter?
Yeah,
as we're recording.
Yeah, we're just coming out of winter, looking forward to spring, and we've had quite an unusual winter in the UK. We've had many storms, much more than we normally would have. So we're really seeing the effects of climate change, so much wetter and windier than we've ever seen before. And of course, that could be a one-off, but we are, slightly concerned that this is the climate of the future.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about your background, because I want to get into talking about what you're doing now, but how have you got into doing what you're doing?
I think, like a lot of people who get into the social housing sector, almost come across it by default. So I got into it because I worked for a local authority and discovered the wonderful world of social housing in particular, and have had a 30-year career in social housing. I've worked for local authorities across Scotland in various roles. I worked in the front line to begin with as a housing officer for 18 months, and then started to progress in the organisations I worked in, mainly in policy, research, performance management, community engagement roles. And I've worked in the main benchmarking organisation in Scotland, where social housing providers come together to share practice, to compare performance and learn from each other. Did that for a long time and really enjoyed that, getting to know the whole sector, getting to know the individuals and see all the great work they do. And more recently, for the last 8 or 9 years, I've worked in what's called the registered social landlord sector. So these are housing associations that are charities, not-for-profit organisations that operate in Scotland. We have around 130 housing associations in Scotland and 32 local authorities. And they all provide social housing, affordable social housing for rent, along with other products, but are very much community-based and focused organisations who provide that really central service in communities in terms of providing housing and support services.
What's the demand? So what give us a kind of an overview of the state of the housing sector and the need for social housing in Scotland?
Well, the base of social housing in Scotland has changed dramatically in the last 30 years. Prior to a specific piece of legislation being introduced in the early 80s, which was called the right to buy, roughly 70% of all housing in Scotland was affordable social housing, and only a small percentage was private rented, and something like 28% was owner occupied.
Up until 1980.
Yeah.
Wow. Is that a contrast to south of your border of the rest of the UK?
No, it was very similar because the right to buy hadn't impacted them at the same time. So the whole of the UK was subject to this right to buy legislation that the Conservative government of the time introduced. Margaret Thatcher, I'm sure remember that politician, introduced it to give tenants the opportunity to be homeowners. And, some would argue that it was much more about tying people into mortgages and, not allowing workers to go on strike, for example, very readily if they had mortgages. So if you were cynical, you would see the right to buy as being a destructive tool. But it completely changed the shape of the housing sector in the UK, never mind social housing. So 30 odd years ago, 7 in 10 people were renters in the affordable housing marketplace. 30 years on, it's completely flipped.
Was that 30%, the 70% of renters, were they renting to private owners at that time?
No, they were
ownership?
State ownership, all local authority owned. Housing associations in the UK had been set up at that point as a vehicle, as a model, a legal model to build housing, but there were very few of them. They were in their infancy. Housing associations have been around for 50 years, but in that first 20 years, when local authorities, the state housing was the main source of housing, housing associations weren't a big part of the marketplace.
Right. And then that's a huge dramatic change in quite a short period of time. That must have shaken up the industry. And I imagine there must have been a lot of speculation and investment. And
yeah, it's had a massive impact. So in terms of the percentage in Scotland of people who are in social housing, it's 22% now. So it's gone from 70% to 22% in that period of time. And the way that's happened is, lots of people bought their local authority, state-owned social house for a massive discount. Even if the local authority who would take out loans to build those properties, as all state and registered social landlords do, they take out large private loans and get subsidy from central government to build these houses. So during the right to buy period, the state-owned, the local authority had to sell the property at a massive discount, regardless of the debt they still held on that property. So it allowed many people in the UK to access home ownership, which in a lot of ways is fantastic. But a lot of people living in social housing could afford the mortgage, but over the years, they've not been able to afford the investment in their properties. So to continue to keep them up to date, new kitchens, bathrooms, windows, doors, roofs, all of that. So there's a huge issue in the standard of our homes now in Scotland for those that were bought through the right to buy but weren't continued to be invested in. Whereas the homes that weren't sold, the local authorities have continued with their investment programmes. So those homes are modern, up to date, fit for purpose. Even if the style and this, of them is, they might be quite old now, but they have to meet the legal standard that we have in Scotland around the quality and the standard of the home. So we've got quite a changed sector.
Very changed. And what about the perception of being in a social house? Because I imagine when 70% of people were renting, it was the norm. Is there a different perception now of social housing and those who live in that type of housing?
Yeah, Matthew, it's changed dramatically, and it's now seen as the tenure of least, best choice, because it's been very much portrayed in the press as the place where the poor go and who behave very badly, and the estates are places that you wouldn't want to go and spend any time. So the image of it has been very much been from that tenure of choice that everyone lived in and grew up in, and to the one of, a place where no one would want to live. Although that has, in the last few years, started to change. And even just last night on our national news, there was a whole piece of reporting on the dire housing crisis we have in Scotland, because there are so many people looking to rent a home, an affordable home, because of the cost of living crisis, that now social housing is being recognised again as this amazing social tool where people can come and live in affordable homes that are high standard, good quality, great communities. And why have we not got enough of it? It's like we've reawoken to the benefits of that model.
And what's the answer to that question of why you don't have enough of it?
It's a pretty complicated one. We've just had a massive budget cut in the announcement of the Scottish Government's budget at the back end of last year, to say we've had a 25% cut in the subsidy levels that are available for new social housing. So that's huge. That's a big blow. But we have also real challenges with practical elements of increasing the number of social housing homes. For example, land prices are through the roof in this country. And it's very hard to, even if when there is subsidy available from government, to find the land in the right place at the right price that allows social housing providers to put a rent, get the rent to comply with what we assume is an affordable level, because the cost of the land and the cost to build at the moment, which is roughly 25-30% higher than normal, is very prohibitive.
That must make going anywhere above the required minimum standard even more challenging. And I'm talking about passive house on a new project. It's
eye-wateringly expensive at the moment to do any house building. And we've even had a number of private house builder firms in the country recently just go into administration because they have got into financial difficulty because of the challenges post-Brexit in terms of material costs and labour costs. So some real challenges in the whole housing sector.
You have got some good success to draw on, though, with some award-winning, an award-winning project, which I think was the first thing that came across my radar of the development in Drymen.
Yeah, it's pronounced Drymen.
Drymen.
And
Thank you.
it's a lovely village in rural Stirlingshire in the heart of Scotland.
And tell us the story about what went on there, because you had some old houses that were yours.
Yeah, we had it's a tiny picturesque village in the middle of the mountains, and the houses that were built there originally by Hanover were seen as temporary homes 60 years ago. Post-war, built with a standard of housing called Dorian style. So assumed they would only last 60 years. And that's exactly how long they did last. But of course, they were bungalows, so all ground floor properties, and were much loved by the elderly people who lived there. And Hanover Housing Association, who I work for, we're an older person specialist. So we don't have 100% housing for older people. It's about 90. We have some housing for other age groups, but it's generally for older people. And many of the tenants in those homes in Drymen had been in those homes for quite some time and came from this very small village where there was virtually no other social housing left because of the right to buy. The local authority had sold most of its properties in that village. As you can imagine, they were very popular.
Yeah. And there's a lovely story which we'll put a link to where people can hear some interviews and some voices of those tenants who have experienced those homes from Scottish Housing News. And you also talk about how you very carefully dealt with that concern that the people clearly had of, a home that they'd spent a lot of their life in, and even I imagine that you're trying to convince them that they're going to get something better. There would be a lot of anxiety around moving out for a period of time, and I think that's addressed really, really nicely there. What I'd like to focus on is why Passive House. When did you first come across Passive House as an organisation, and what made that viable for that project?
Well, I didn't work for the organisation when the board approved the adoption of the Passive House standard for the new build. But in Scotland, the Passive House standard, we've been very much aware of it for many years now, and quite a lot of housing providers have adopted it in organisations to try out the standard. And a big reason for that is our climate and the issue of fuel poverty in Scotland. Given, we generally have 3 seasons of very cold, wet and windy weather, and, one season that pretends to be slightly warmer called summer. So it's such a big issue for our tenants. But we also have 2 standards in social housing in Scotland that have to be met. And the first one is the Scottish Housing Quality Standard, which is much more about space and the amenities that are available in a home. And then more recently, we've had an energy efficiency standard that we refer to as EISH. And that has really shone a light on the energy efficiency requirements in social housing, but also much more from how does the country meet net zero standards and targets. So we've been aware of it for a long time. And when we were looking at the challenges that our tenants had in Drymen, in their existing homes, it primarily related to heating their home. They loved their homes. They didn't want to leave them. They were absolutely not pleasant homes to live in. So because of the construction style causing lots of condensation and dampness, but also just the heating system was an old style of electric heating because there is no gas supply in the village. So there were so many challenges with it, including the fact that we could have refurbished the properties, but the space standards in the properties didn't meet the new quality standards or building regulations. So we could never have allowed them to meet that standard. So demolition and rebuild was the only viable option. But when you're in a small village that's at quite a high elevation like that, then we knew we'd have to do something special to keep our tenants as warm and as protected from fuel poverty as possible. And the passive house standard seemed like the obvious way to go.
What's Hanover's role in utility bills? Do you help tenants with those, or do you just provide the house?
It depends on the style of house or development that we build. In this development, because they are individual homes, they're not flats, then we don't have a role at all other than to put in an effective heating system, and then it's up to the tenant to arrange to pay their own utility bills.
Right. But as part of your overarching goal, which is essentially looking after people, that you can justify what I'm assuming is a slightly more expensive build cost for you, because it's gonna look after your people better.
Absolutely. There's, it's an easy argument to make in terms of slightly higher build costs, requiring slightly higher subsidy levels from the government to keep the rents affordable, because fuel poverty obviously is linked to your overall household budget. And if your rents are taking up a massive amount of that, you are going to really struggle to pay your utility bills. So keeping the rents affordable, as well as having an energy efficient, warm home with an easy to use heating system is a big part of that.
And has that been an easy argument to make?
It has been with our board and with Scottish Government for this development, but it's the only passive house development we've built.
Yeah. So where to from here?
Well, the jury is out, because the build in Drymen is such an unusual one for us, because it's bungalows with some double-storey housing, but very little. We normally don't build properties like that. We normally build sheltered housing developments where you have 30 roughly properties, flats, all in one building with a communal area, a communal heating system, and a kitchen, for example, because we provide meals as part of our sheltered housing service. And so the passive house development in Stirling doesn't allow us to judge whether that approach would work in that very different building style that we would normally build. So we've no new developments planned at the stage where we have to decide which heating system or standard we would use. So we're using this period of time while we have a slight hiatus in our new build programme to evaluate whether we would use the passive house design for what comes next.
Sounds like a good challenge for the passive house design community. But how's the process been in general from through the passive house process? I mean, through the build certification and then sort of optimizing the performance of the build afterwards.
Yeah, I mean it was a fairly straightforward build, and we had our accreditation without any trouble. So all of that seemed to work well. The architects that we used were very well informed, and so the whole process went really smoothly. In terms of how our tenants are finding living in a passive house as older people generally, it's a really mixed bag, I have to say. If you were going on the tenant experience alone, we wouldn't do it again for that age group.
Mm-hmm.
because the feedback from probably the majority of our tenants is they find the heating system and the whole concept of living in a passive house so different from what they have been used to their whole life, that they struggle to manage it effectively.
Yeah, and I thought I appreciated the that honest feedback when I was listening back to the conversation that you did previously, and I think there's some really good learning there around just how different that might be for someone who's lived in a completely different internal environment. So I think there's some really important learning there for how to make that transition smoother and to make the benefits more, I guess, acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's a dead interesting observation of, older people are generally at home most of the day. And I suppose a lot of people are now, post-COVID. The way we use our home has changed. So the way we need heat is changed in terms of it's not just in the morning and then when you come back from work in the evening, for example. So I think the lifestyle of who's living in a passive house is important in terms of how they are then educated on how to use that system. And I can hear, I've visited the development and spoken to the tenants a few times now. And the general story is the training they received from the various people involved in this process and journey they have been on has been so inconsistent,
right,
that they are confused. And that is, I think, an issue we have in the country about who actually has the knowledge and the skills of how to operate a passive house and a heat pump heating system that can give you simple advice on how to operate your home effectively. So some tenants were terrified to even touch a single dial because one of the people on the site at the end of the build told them not to touch a single button because it would muck it all up. So they went for months not realising they could actually tailor when it all kicked in for them, their heating system. So it took months for us to figure out that a lot of people had been scared off from, tailoring the heating system and timings, etc., to suit their lifestyle. So we've had to go back a few times now and unpick a lot of that and give people new advice and keep going back to check it is working for their lifestyle and the times that they need more or less heat. And, even what temperature they want the property to be at during the evening, because a lot of the tenants had their windows open all night long because it was far too hot in the property and they were really uncomfortable. So we've tried to work with them to get all of that right for them as individual households.
Yeah. You mentioned at the beginning you've had some interesting weather, and which is storms. But are you also is it getting warmer? Do you feel like the summer's been warmer and perhaps a little bit milder during winter?
Yeah, we've definitely not had as much, as long a cold snap as we would normally do in winter months. So it's definitely got milder, wetter. We have had cold weather. We have had a bit of snow in Scotland, but it has not lasted any length of time because on the back of it, we get a mild but wet and windy storm coming in, which has been an absolute feature of this winter. Right.
And I think further south in the UK, they had some pretty severe heat waves during the last summer, which I imagine is only going to make the design of homes more challenging as well.
Yeah, definitely. And we had a bit of that in Scotland as well, not as severe, but we definitely had some challenges. And when you speak to some of our tenants, they were finding the passive house just too hot for them. So had windows open in the summer found it quite difficult
Yeah.
at night times trying to sleep in such a warm home.
Yeah. You also mentioned earlier on that it was a wonderful world of social housing, which I think you were genuine when you talk about that, because you wouldn't have been working in it for so long. Why is it such a wonderful space to work in?
It's just wonderful to be able to build homes for people to live in that transforms their life. You know, the home is the most important thing you have in your life to flourish. If you don't have a home, then there's, so many challenges you face. So being in a sector where you can provide new homes, but also support people to live very well in their existing home, then it's just the most rewarding sector to work in. And because I worked in so many different roles at so many different levels, you get to see that in all of its manifestations, whether it's helping people who are experiencing homelessness, whether it's helping people who are in a house that's too small and they now have a growing family and they want to move to a bigger house, or whether it's like in the role I'm in just now, working with older people to make their later years fun, engaging, and keeping them as independent and at home for as long as possible is just the best job to be doing. So it's brilliant, and it's a sector that is actually a little bit unknown in the world, I think. People, when they ask me what I do, they probably have never heard of a housing association or the social housing movement. So we are in the country trying to improve the awareness of it as a profession and get more people in, because it's a very rewarding career.
Yeah, great. Well, keep up the good work, you and the team there. Thank you very much, Angela. I really appreciate your time, and all the best for doing more of what you do.
Thank you. It's lovely to meet you.
And that was Angela Currie, who's Chief Executive of Hanover, Scotland. Interesting chat, and I think a really good, honest look at a first attempt at a passive house. Well, first successful attempt at building a passive house. And I think it is useful to reflect on some of the challenges of implementing such a high standard into any building environment, any place where that hasn't been the norm, which is most places, but also the importance of communicating not just with the people who are creating that building, but the people who are going to be in that building as well. Because for a lot of people, going from a drafty, colder house that relied on lots of heating that you had to interact with, whether it's a radiator or electric heating you had to turn on and off, into a passive house, it's a different way of living and operating that building. And I think I've often thought about this, the fact that my passive house journey has been a decade long, and I've had plenty of time to get my head around it, get used to the ideas, go back and forth a few times. And we sometimes forget that for a lot of people, they're hearing about passive house for the very first time. And I have to sort of take myself back to that time when I first heard about it and was skeptical and thought, this air tightness thing doesn't make sense. And I often forget that it's taken me a long time to get to where I am now as being an advocate of all those things and understanding it. And we need to give people a bit of slack, I think, and help them get to that point in ideally a shorter length of time than what it took me.
Yeah, right. Same.
Yeah. What do you think,
I mean, this is right. It was like a lesson in kind of the sometimes the challenges of managing change.
Yeah.
And I have to say, it's easy to forget about that. My experience of passive house, being in passive house buildings, it has been one of really kind of a simple experience, right? It's quiet. It's the air is fresh. This experience of that the occupants of the building were relaying were surprising to me, honestly. And I think that it was too bad that there was that information about the kind of don't touch the dials. And the fear, kind of maybe a little bit of a fear instilled in the system. Like the system is so delicate, you can't, don't mess with it. When it's a very simple system, and you just have a better building envelope and smaller mechanical systems than you may be accustomed to. And it's hard to kind of break anything.
Yeah.
But if you can't touch the dials and you feel like you're too warm and you can't touch the dial on that, to adjust for that, that's a shame. And I think can, lead to some unhappy results, so that I think the kind of managing of expectations or some orientation to the fact that these buildings are different. I mean, some of it just comes down to interacting with a heat pump, right? And I think of like the first time not the first time, just the first 5 times I had to deal with a ductless mini split and the remote control and understanding that's just that's a learning curve, and there are a lot of buttons to look at.
I have no idea why there are so many buttons on a heat pump.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. And then, I think my first time was in Japan too, so it was all in. It made it more challenging. Yeah. But so there's just a little bit of education that needs to happen, and it's clear that it's super important.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you have unhappy occupants, and that's the opposite of what we're after with Passive House. Like our expectation is that these are very gracious, easy places and very comfortable places to inhabit. So good reminder.
I also just realized that for a lot of us, our first experiences of Passive House have been something that we've visited. We've gone, checked it out, and then we've left again. Then we've gone to see another one for a short amount of time, and we sort of evolved to a point where we decide that we'd like one. And that's a very different experience. It's being attracted to something and wanting that than being told this is your new home, which feels a bit more like it's being imposed on you. And regardless of how good something is or how good we think something will be for someone, there's a natural resistance to anything that we feel is being imposed on us. And that's the same for the building community as it is for tenants in a home. So I think we need to be very conscious of that as well. Of just because we think it's great and we're fully on board, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to come across well if we just say, "Hey, use this, you'll love it because it's awesome, but don't touch anything. Just trust it.
Don't break it." Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think some really good learning there. Now this is in Scotland. It's an evolving story. This week, as we're recording, there's been a bit of pushback from the wider builder community in Scotland because, as we pointed out in the top of the show, Scotland's been applauded in the Passive House community for developing a building code, which is pretty much equivalent to Passive House. So Passive House Trust has been very positive about this. It's due to come into effect later this year, 2024. But there's been a call this week from some of the building community to pause and review that decision. And I think that, we're gonna see how this plays out. This is sort of, it's not quite breaking, but it is an evolving story. So we're not quite sure where this is going to land. But I think it's yet another reminder of the importance of bringing the whole community along on this journey, and that there is always going to be some resistance to change and some fear of the unknown. Zach, have you got any thoughts about kind of what's emerging in that scene?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't. If anyone in Scotland is listening to this episode, I would just say that there are so many great examples of what we call multifamily buildings. So, essentially apartment buildings, affordable housing projects, so the equivalent of social housing, that are passive house in the United States and in North America, in Canada as well. And that the affordable housing community has really been on the forefront of adoption of passive house because of its the health benefits and the comfort benefits and the elimination of fuel poverty, all of those things. And so this is happening in, British Columbia and Toronto and Ontario, New York and Massachusetts. Passive house has become the centerpiece for building policy in New York State and in Massachusetts as well. And that's all because these buildings work and they're comfortable and they're healthy. So I understand the political pushback and honestly the pushback from the Home Builders Association in North America, in the United States, is always very predictable when it comes to improvements in building code. But the reason we need the improvements in building code is for better health, for better energy performance, and for lower impact on the climate crisis. To basically start to address it. So I hope that progress continues in Scotland. It's really exciting to see, and there are examples elsewhere in the world of the great success that can bring.
Yeah, and as the Passive House Trust has reflected back and responded to this recent request to pause, they have been open about the expected upfront cost, which I think is helpful. It's not being unrealistic, but they're also saying that they're basing their reduced heating demand up to 79%, compared to the current building regulations. So it's a massive savings. So it makes sense to have a very small, we're talking 4 to 8% premium, and that's also assuming very similar size and shape houses.
Well, so think about what we just experienced for the last couple of years with the invasion of Ukraine and the spike in energy costs and all over the place.
Yeah,
this makes so much sense to be less dependent on heating for our buildings. Sorry to interrupt you, but
no.
Yeah.
We are preaching to the choir here.
Yes, we are. But
and so I guess coming back, we just need to be conscious of the rest of the community. Appreciate that it's a bit daunting if this is something new that they feel has been imposed on them, and to reach out and to just say, to try and address some of those concerns and say, what's really behind all this? Why are we trying to slow things down when we really need to speed up the production of better designs and better buildings?
Right.
And so let's keep an eye on that, and we'll see how it unfolds in Scotland.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, back at the accelerator, we've got some things happening.
Indeed. So next week we have our 101 series of Passive House Accelerator Live on the first Wednesday of the month with Enrico Bonalari. He is the co-founder and CPO, or Chief Passive Officer of Emu Passive, and he will be presenting Unusual Suspects of Building Science, Details That Matter. So catch that on May 1st. Wednesday. And then on Thursday, we have a very exciting Passive House component spotlight with Gradient. So this is accelerating building decarbonization with gradient window heat pumps. And that's going to be with Dr. Vincent Romanen, Brian Elder, and Rob Mobini of Gradient. And the information for both of these events is on the Passive House Accelerator homepage under events. And then also May 17th, mark your calendar, we have the Prefab Conference, Reimagine Buildings Prefab. happening, and that's going to be 3 hours of programming, and then networking and a trade show patterned after Reimagine Buildings 24. We hope everyone will come. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Zach.
Thank you, Matthew.
We'll be back again next week on Passive House Podcast.